Yeah, so my name is Crinan. I'm a postdoc now at the Swiss Ornithological Institute. As Ellie said, I recently finished my PhD that I did at the University of Glasgow. And the work I'll talk about today is mostly work I did during my PhD, but I'll also talk a bit about our plans for the coming years with the Swiss Institute. So this chocolate project has only been possible thanks to a really international team of people, some of which are listed below, which include people from Cameroon, Scotland, and Portugal. Okay, so let's see. Good. So the heat map here shows the global biodiversity, and what you can see very clearly is that global biodiversity is concentrated in the tropics. And then we can overlap, on this map, we can overlap a map of tropical forests, so tropical rainforests of the world. And what is very evident is that it's a perfect match. So most of the world's biodiversity is within the tropical rainforests. However, tropical rainforests are under constant threat and are being constantly degraded and deforested. And this map here shows the primary drivers of deforestation across the world in the past few decades. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is that in the neotropics and in Southeast Asia, we have this red color dominating. And this red color is this large-scale intensive industrialized agriculture. In contrast, in Africa, it's the yellow color that dominates. And the yellow color is this low-intensity, small-scale shifting agriculture. And one of the main crops grown under these conditions is cocoa. So cocoa, which, as you know, goes on to produce chocolate, which we all love, is the fastest expanding export-oriented crop in the world. So it's growing massively. And 70% of the world's cocoa is grown in Africa. The interesting thing about cocoa is that it can be grown under a range of conditions. So the graph in the middle here shows a sort of gradient of cocoa plantations. In the top one here, we have very low intensity, whoops, okay, spoiler alert. In the top one, we have very low intensity cocoa agroforestry. So what happens here is that a farmer just goes into the forest and clears a little bit the understory and then plants the cocoa trees there. So you maintain a thick canopy of shade trees above. Then we have a sort of middle scenario where some of the larger shade trees are removed, but we still maintain some shade trees above the cocoa. And then we have the sort of intensified scenario where we remove all trees completely and we just plant cocoa. And recently, in the past decades, there's been a push from policymakers, governments, etc., to intensify cocoa. So to remove shade trees from your cocoa farms and just have it in this high intensity cultivation. And the reason for this is that short-term yields tend to be higher in these high-intensity cocoa farms. So if we remove the trees, we have like a spike in productivity. However, there's also evidence showing that in the longer term, these farms suffer from pest and disease outbreaks, and therefore the long-term yields are comparable or even lower than shady farms. But yeah, in general, there's a move towards intensified cocoa farms because of the short-term gains. Okay, so for my PhD, my main aim was to understand how this range of management of cocoa farms could affect the bird communities that are inside these farms and what the implications are for ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation. So yeah, today I'll talk about two projects I did during my PhD. The first one is a study on the response of bird communities to cocoa management. And the second one is a study on the effects of birds on the arthropod community in cocoa farms and yields. So first of all, the first study I want to talk about is this one where we look at the effective cocoa management on bird communities. For this study, I used a data set compiled from a bunch of collaborators. There might be some people even who contributed data here. It's people who have been catching birds using mist nets in Cameroon in both forest and cocoa sites since the 1990s. So we ended up with 83 sites, some of them forest, some of them cocoa, and then the sort of complication was that the sampling was unstandardized because it was from a range of collaborators. So I had to sort of come up with ways of dealing with that. To this data set, I also added my own data collected during my PhD. So during my PhD, we sampled birds using mist nets in 32 cocoa farms in 2019-2020. We did 4 mist net sessions, and this is Melanie and Fanny who helped me in the field. We also, in the study, I also considered environmental variables. Most importantly is shade cover. So as I mentioned, that's the amount of canopy cover above the cocoa trees. To measure shade cover, we used essentially a giant selfie stick. So it's a camera mounted on a very long pole that extends beyond the cocoa trees. Here we use it as a selfie stick, but in reality, we used it mostly focusing upwards. So we took a picture above the cocoa, and then we quantified the percentage of cover of tree cover above the cocoa trees. I also considered forest cover at a larger scale, so around the farms, how much forest is there. So I did this using satellite imagery, and these are 2 examples of some of my study farms. And in these pictures, black means no tree cover, and white means 100% tree cover. And you can see that in the left panel, we have these farms that are on the outskirts of Yaoundé. So there's very low tree cover in the landscape. And on the other extreme, we have this farm here, which is right at the edge of a forest reserve. So really the surrounding landscape is very forested. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly introduce. So my first question with the study was, I had these forest sites, I had the cocoa sites, and I wanted to work out whether there was differences in the diversity of birds between cocoa and forest. And I'm going to briefly introduce how I did this. So imagine these 3 plots, right? A, B, and C are 3 different cocoa farms, which contain a community of birds, which looks strangely like cows and sheep. So now alpha diversity is the diversity of each individual plot, right? So in this plot, we would have 2 species. So that would be the alpha diversity. Whereas gamma diversity is the diversity of the whole community considered together. So I looked at both these measures. On this slide, you see 2 plots. The left-hand plot is the gamma diversity. So that is the whole community, all the cocoa sites clustered and all the forest sites clustered. And on the right-hand plot, we have alpha diversity, which is the diversity per plot. And in both of these plots, on the y-axis, we have the diversity. And on the x-axis, we have this Q value. And the Q value is a parameter that defines how much importance we give to rare species. Okay, so at low values of Q, we treat all species equally. It doesn't matter if you catch one species 100 times and another species 1 time, they each count as 1 species. Then as we increase the Q value, we start to disregard rare species. And so we just consider the common species in the community. Yeah, exactly. So first of all, the plot on the left, that's gamma diversity. So what we can see here is that at Q equals 0, so when we consider all species equally, we have actually a higher diversity in cocoa than we do in forest. Then as we increase the value of Q, so as we start to ignore the rarer species, the lines come together and we have an equal diversity between cocoa and forest. So what that means here is that in cocoa, we have quite a lot of species that occur at very low abundances. So we have these like captures of rare species or uncommon species in cocoa. Then on the right-hand plot, we have alpha diversity. So that is the diversity per plot. And here you can see that there's no difference really between cocoa and forest plots. So at the plot level, we have equal diversity in cocoa and forest. So initially, this was kind of confusing because we thought, how is it possible that when we look at individual plots, the diversity is the same, but when we look at the whole community, the diversity is higher in cocoa? And then we realized that the interpretation here is that this means that cocoa plots are more different between each other. So when you look at the plot level, you have a similar number of species, but then when you add up all the plots together, you get higher number of species in cocoa than you do in forest. So cocoa plots are more dissimilar between each other. So that's the differences in terms of diversity. Then we wanted to look at what the differences are in terms of community composition. So of the roughly 9,500 captures in my data set, I grouped them into guilds. So first we have 3 common guilds: insectivores, frugivores, and nectarivores, which I don't need to describe. And then I also added 3 foraging guilds, which are kind of like important in rainforest habitats. So we have a mixed flock species, which are species that participate in this behavior of joining flocks and foraging together. We have ant followers, which are these normally larger bodied insectivores that follow ant swarms. And we have forest specialists, which are birds that are recorded as being restricted to rainforest habitats. So then I looked at how the relative abundance of these different guilds varied between forest and then 2 types of cocoa farm: the shady cocoa, so low intensity agroforestry, and then the full sun intensified cocoa. So on these plots, on the y-axis, we have relative abundance, so the percentage of the community represented by each guild. And the main thing you can see here is that the 3 sort of specialized foraging guilds, which are the ant followers, the forest specialists, and the mixed flock species, occur at much higher abundances in mature forest than they do in cocoa. And the shady cocoa represents some sort of intermediate. So, for example, ant followers are about 20% of the community in mature forest, maybe 5% in shady cocoa, and less than 1% in full sun cocoa. So the shady farms, they're not a substitute for forest, but they somehow represent an intermediate between forest and intensified cocoa. In contrast with some other guilds like frugivores, we have an opposite pattern where they occur at lower abundances in the forest than they do in cocoa. Then I looked at the effect of landscape on the relative abundance of these groups. So in this case, I'm considering the amount of forest surrounding our cocoa farms and how that influences the relative abundance of each foraging guild. So for insectivores, frugivores, nectarivores, and mixed flock species, we found no strong effect. But for ant followers and forest specialists, we found that the relative abundance increases significantly with increasing amount of forest on the landscape. Which makes sense. I mean, if your cocoa farm is surrounded by forest, then you have a better connectivity and you have these forest birds entering your farms. Okay, now I'm going to talk about another study I did during my PhD. And this was to try to quantify the contribution of birds towards productivity in cocoa farms. And this has recently been published, so I'm happy to present these findings now. In this study, I worked alongside a bat scientist. So the study actually quantifies the contribution of birds and bats jointly towards cocoa productivity. So we'll be Friday for birds and bats today for a little while. Okay. So for this study, we chose 8 of our larger group of cocoa farms. So we chose 8 farms because it was quite an involved study. And these farms include both more shady farms and more sunny farms. So then our plan was to, in these farms, conduct an exclusion experiment, which basically means excluding some cocoa trees from birds and bats. so blocking the access of birds and bats to some cocoa trees. And on the left-hand picture, you see our practice exclosure, which was super bad. And there's someone looking kind of depressed there in the corner. So, but we got better with practice. And yeah, we ended up managing to set up these exclosures quite well in the farm. So in each farm, in each of the 8 farms, we had 2 trees that were covered by these nets. So 2 trees where the birds and bats couldn't access, and 2 control trees, which were trees that were very similar to the experimental trees, but not covered. And I'm crediting Diogo here. He's the Batman I worked with, and he also made this cool animation, which I'm going to let you watch so you kind of get the idea. But basically, the animation shows the control trees where the birds and the bats can access, and theoretically they're eating the pests or the insects, versus the exclosures where the birds and the bats can't access, and therefore we expect arthropods to increase in abundance. I'll just give you a minute to look at it so you have an idea.
Crinan, we have 2 bat experts in the team.
Oh,
Paul
cool.
and Joanna is perfect. Friday for birds and bats. Yes. Watch out.
Okay, I hope I do them justice. The bats. Okay, cool. So during these exclosures in our farms were set up for 1 year. And during this year, every month, we had our colleague Alan Wanji, who's an entomologist, visit the trees and count. On each tree, he counted all the arthropods he could find, and he also counted pods and flowers. The arthropods he sorted to order level, and he also considered pests sort of separately. Yeah, okay, so I'll go into our main results. So what we found, so in these plots, you can see each of the different insect orders that we looked at. And then in all of these plots, the black bar represents the control. So those are the trees where the birds and the bats can access. And the yellow bar represents the exclosure, which are the trees where the birds and the bats can't access, right? And the main result here I want to draw your attention to is that for hemipterans and for mealybugs, we have much higher abundance in the exclosures than in the controls. So this means when we don't let the birds and the bats access, these groups increase in abundance. So effectively, birds and bats are controlling the populations of these groups in our cocoa farms, which is interesting because mealybugs are a known pest of cocoa, and hemiptera include many groups which are also pests of cocoa. When we look at pollinator groups, which include dipterans, hymenopterans, and ants, we find no strong difference between control and exclusion. And then there's a sort of slightly conflicting result, which is that when we look at predatory arthropods, so these are arthropods that eat other arthropods, like spiders and mantis, we find a lower abundance in control than in exclosures. So what this means is that when we remove birds and bats, these arthropods go up in abundance. So birds and bats are kind of, in a way, doing a disservice because they actually eat the predatory arthropods in cocoa farms. So of course, this then makes us think, okay, so what wins, the service or the disservice? So what are the actual effects of birds and bats on cocoa productivity? And our study showed that the contribution of birds and bats to cocoa productivity is highly dependent on shade cover. So in the shady farms, we find that inside the exclosures, we have a much lower abundance of flowers and of pods. So when we remove birds and bats, we have lower productivity in shady farms. And we calculated that removing birds and bats from shady farms results in losses of up to 450 euros per hectare per year to the farmers. So this is really a big loss for a smallholder farmer if we were to eliminate birds and bats from shady cocoa farms. On the other hand, when we look at sunny cocoa farms, so these intensified cocoa farms, we find the opposite effect. So we find that when we exclude birds and bats, we get a higher number of flowers and a higher number of pods. So essentially, in sunny cocoa farms, birds and bats are doing some sort of disservice, whereas in shady cocoa farms, they provide a service. So our outcomes of this study are that ecosystem services in cocoa farms are dependent on local shade tree management. So really the contribution of birds and bats to cocoa productivity depends on how you manage your farm. So, and importantly, birds and bats can mitigate the losses in production caused by going from a full sun to a traditional cocoa farm. So as I mentioned, the our understanding is that if we have a sunny farm and then we add shade trees, our productivity goes down. But what our study shows that the presence of bats and birds reduces that or eliminates that decrease in productivity of going from a sunny farm to a shady farm. And this was a kind of complex study with a lot of interactions. So if you want to look at the paper, it's here. And yeah, I invite you to go and read it because there's a lot of kind of complex and interesting interactions going on between groups, which was cool to see. Okay, so in the final minutes of the talk, I just want to briefly discuss what our future plans are. So as I mentioned, I'm now at the Swiss Ornithological Institute working with Ellie, amongst others, and where I'm involved mostly in two sort of main projects. So the first project is in collaboration with several people who are present here today, including Professor Elier and other people. And this project is about developing a bird-friendly cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire. So this project is sort of a continuation of some of the work I did during my PhD, but really trying to focus on what can we do in cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire to make them better for birds. And of course, because we're at the Swiss Ornithological Institute, we're especially interested in migratory birds. So can we find, for example, specific shade trees that we can add to our farms that will make them better for birds and migratory species included. Secondly, another project, which is a sort of broader project looking at the effects of land use change on migratory species. And there's several branches of this project, including colleagues working in Burkina Faso, Ellie's work in East Africa, and potential projects in Senegal and other places. So here, we're not focusing exclusively on cocoa, we're taking a broader picture and trying to understand how land use change affects migratory birds during the wintering period in Africa. So if any of these studies are, if either of these studies are interesting to you and you want to reach out, my contact details are here. And yeah, I want to acknowledge several funders and collaborators on this project. And now I'm hoping someone who speaks better French than me will translate.